Hello and welcome to the Investigative Journal, everyone. I'm Tal Heinrich in New York. Today we're exploring the very sensitive question of how to deal with ISIS returnees, the wives of extremist fighters and their innocent children hoping to go back to their home countries as the global terror group continues to crumble. In the United Kingdom, the government decided to revoke the citizenship of 2 British ISIS members who desperately announced in the press their intentions to return home. This was viewed by some as a controversial decision, void of any human rights considerations. The move in one case also drew criticism from Canada. At the age of 19, Shamima Begum was one of 3 schoolgirls to leave Bethnal Green to join the Islamic State in 2015. When ISIS still held power in the country, the teenager was part of its morality police, carrying a Kalashnikov rifle. Begum became known as a strict enforcer of the group's conservative laws, such as dress codes for women. Having lost the first 2 children she had with Dutch ISIS fighter Yago Reddick, she recently lost her 3rd baby shortly after the British government stripped her citizenship. Begum remains in a refugee camp in Syria alongside around 20 British women and children and 6 suspected fighters. Another eye-opening case is of Muslim convert Jack Letts, a 24-year-old who had held dual UK and Canadian citizenship. He declared he was an enemy of Britain after traveling from Oxfordshire to Syria at the age of 18 to join ISIS. Letts has begged to be allowed to return to the UK from Syria, insisting he had no intention of killing Britons. This after he was captured by Kurdish forces in 2017. The Home Office has stripped Letts off his British citizenship, meaning he is the responsibility of the Canadian government now. With us from London today to explain these highly complicated laws and cases is a man who has once promoted that dark side of Islamic extremism himself. Hanif Qadir is a former Al-Qaeda member who traveled to Afghanistan in 2002 before he disavowed the ideologies of the late Osama bin Laden and his terror group. He returned home when he realized that innocent women and children were being wrongly killed in the name of Islam. At the height of his influence, Mr. Hanif Qadir became a senior expert with the UK's counter-radicalization program, working with some of the country's most dangerous extremists through managing the Active Change Foundation in London. It is a charity formerly funded by the British government. Let's say hello to Mr. Hanif Qadir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there, it's a pleasure.
Hanif, before we start discussing particular cases here, explain broadly, where do you stand in the very tough debate of whether or not to allow former members of ISIS to go back to their home countries from places like Syria? Some people believe this is a danger to national security. Others, though, think that ISIS returnees have the potential to become a useful tool for counter-terrorism and educational purposes if they really change their ways and their beliefs.
With regards to some of these young men and women that are being caught up in the conflict and are being recruited by ISIS, the first thing that we have to look at is, with regards to Shamima Begum, when she was groomed or radicalized, let's say, she was only a minor. And we, the British government and our institutions, failed to protect that girl from being groomed, manipulated, abused, and radicalized. So it's our failure in the first place. And by her going there, joining ISIS, you are then part of a very violent and hostile network. And if you disagree with them, then we all know what happens to you. And because now she's in a refugee camp, and I believe, look, I understand that a lot of these individuals that have been caught and are held in refugee camps that would ordinarily be a threat to UK government or UK society, it doesn't mean that you bring them home and you let them free. They have to go through due process. And like Jack Letts as well, I worked with that particular individual and his parents. And I know that, he's got a sudden change of heart, but I still think that whether he has or whether he hasn't rejected the ISIS narrative and the terrorist ideology, I still believe that they would be a threat to UK society, but they still need to be given a chance to be able to be rehabilitated, go through due process, remain in prison for as long as it would take, but they have a right to be given that chance to change. And we now fight to combat terrorism and terrorist recruitment.
Hanif, what was the change like for you? You have been on both sides of the coin right off the top. What is your story in a nutshell?
Well, my story, if you're going to join an organization, or you're going to fight in places like Afghanistan to protect civilians and innocent women and children, which is, I argue that a lot of the driving and the push factors are because of the foreign policy in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. When you're sympathetic towards the loss of innocent civilians and children, and then you are subjected to those very same people who are supposed to be fighting a holy war, who are carrying out the same kind of atrocities and using children and innocent people to become suicide bombers, that was the final line for me. That's where I decided that this was not part of my religious beliefs. It wasn't something that I agreed with. My beliefs and my sympathy and emotions were driven towards the innocent women and children. And if the people that I'm going to stand and fight with are doing the same thing, then I'm afraid I'm going to reject that. And I believe that certain people... Was it easy for you
to go back home?
I mean, I was a strong... It's not easy for anybody. You have to turn your back on a violent, organization, and in that you're going to risk your own life. I wasn't a young teenager like Shamima Begum or a young person like Jack Letts. I was a much more mature individual, and I managed to sort of turn my back on them and walk away. And I believe that people like Shamima and Jack, I know it's difficult for them, but because it's very risky. ISIS is a completely different entity in regards to ISIS versus Al Qaeda, but nonetheless, it would be very risky for them to turn their back on ISIS or even disagree with them, because they would have got killed, especially Shamima Begum. I still believe that by giving them a chance to go through due process, be imprisoned for as long as it takes for them to be rehabilitated, these young men and women could be used as assets and tools to rehabilitate and change other young men and women, in fact, prevent them from even considering such an ideology.
Let me read to you what the British Nationality Act of 1981 states. It says the Home Secretary has the power to deprive a British national of their citizenship if it has been gained through fraud, or if the Home Office is satisfied that deprivation is conducive to the public good. So on what basis has the Home Office revoked the citizenship of Shamima Begum, especially that she had no other nationality? Does the law support making someone stateless?
I'm not too savvy or familiar with the immigration laws and the rights that the Home Secretary have, but what I do understand is that historically and even in the recent past, we've had individuals that have gone to fight for against ISIS. They've been exposed to atrocities. They've been exposed to dealing with weaponry, and I believe that in certain circumstances, our Home Secretary at the time was Sajid Javid. I believe that they pick and choose which cases and which individuals to prevent from returning or revoke their citizenship. I think it's a bit of hypocrisy there and a bit of a double standards. And don't forget, that's also seen by hundreds of thousands of people, in this country and abroad, that when they choose to, they revoke a citizenship. When they choose not to, they don't. So in regards to these particular cases, look, I'm not for 1 minute condoning their acts. But what I'm saying in regards to Shamima Begum, she was a minor when she was radicalized and abused, just like many other minors who get sexually groomed and abused by adults in this country. They are classed as victims, and so too is Shamima Begum. With regards to Jack Letts, look, an individual that's got learning difficulties, but also has been, radicalized and joined that terrorist network. I don't condone that. What I say is that it's very harsh that we've got to, revoke the citizenship and not give those individuals a chance of being rehabilitated. And, we're turning a blind eye to become judge, jury, and executioners at the same time. And it's wrong for the Home Secretary at the time to pander to the public or to the political convention at the moment.
I know you're very familiar personally with the Jack Latz case as a practitioner who had managed the Active Change Foundation. So tell us a bit about your intervention way early in Latz's case, known as Jihadi Jack. When his parents contacted you, they say they were only trying to help their son come back home, and then they found themselves facing terrorism charges for information they gave to the police.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to Jihadi Jack, we intervened. I don't think it was early enough, but we intervened when he'd already traveled to Syria, and the parents. For us, it was about giving those parents some support to help them to come to terms with the situation that they're experiencing, but then looking at the mother, and both parents were crying because it was their son. And they wanted to try to help as much as possible, like any other parent would. It was then, for us to try and make things easy for them, but also try to communicate with Jack through Facebook Messenger and through Facebook, conversations, to try to get him to see things differently. It took a long time for us to even have a fruitful conversation with him. At the very beginning, he was quite hostile towards me, and it's understandable because I'm communicating with an individual who's amongst a network of very violent people. So he cannot immediately start to engage with me to have a meaningful dialogue. It took a bit of time for us to have some kind of dialogue, and eventually we started to have a two-way conversation where we could agree and disagree on many things. But that meant for us that we had, we created a pathway to get him to consider an alternative view. And that's what's very important when you're working with individuals like him or extremists or terrorists, is that when you get a chance to, for the individual to consider an alternative viewpoint, that's a good outcome, and it's a road to disengagement. Unfortunately, we advised the parents that the parents were convinced that he's on a pathway to change now, and I wasn't convinced at the moment that he is. I thought we are. It's a step at a time, but because of parents, and they were very emotional, they saw a huge amount of hope in their child as becoming, de-radicalized. So they decided to send him money, and we told them, don't do that, because I don't think he's ready yet, and I think it could be manipulated, it could be deceptive. But I wanted to be sure that our progress was effective, and it was 100%. But unfortunately, being a mother, I don't think they were willing to be patient enough, and unfortunately they decided to send their son some money, and that's where it was an offence to send money to a known terrorist. So that's why I think they got arrested and ultimately, unfortunately, got convicted.
You said 100% before. Nowadays, you believe that Jack Latz is 100% no kind of national security danger?
Absolutely not. I would never say that. I would say that even if he is, and he probably will be, a threat to UK society, because you have to look at all of the factors and the circumstances that he is being exposed to, and currently lives in a situation where the environment and the dialogue is out of our control. But nonetheless, I believe in giving a person a chance. I think he should go through due process. He needs to be given a prison sentence if he's deemed a threat. But then also, I think, like every other convicted terrorist in this country, they have a program of disengagement and de-radicalization. And I believe that the rehabilitation, the reintegration programs in this country should be given a chance. I mean, Jack should be given a chance to go through those programs, once he's gone through the judicial process.
Listen, there's a point to be made here about deterrence. When you strip someone off his citizenship, it's also supposed to deter other people from, in the future joining radical groups. What do you think about that? Isn't it effective?
I think it's a very harsh. I don't think it's going to be effective, because look, when you've got individuals who are serious about committing acts of terrorism, when they want to join a network, stripping them of their citizenship is not going to work. And don't forget, the evolution of the threat of terrorism is on a constant. This is a very fluid and it's changing by nature almost hourly or daily. And the threat and the challenges that we face currently and in the future are going to change and define the way that we tackle this. We are years behind these individuals. Every time we try to put in a program to de-radicalize or disengage or prevent individuals, the ideology and the narrative has moved on. So by removing them of their citizenship is not going to work. We've got a new threat emerging, which, if it does continue on this pathway, people who want to go and join terrorist networks or want to carry out terrorism will do so nonetheless, irregardless of whether they lose their citizenship or not. We're talking about people who are prepared to lose their lives. They're prepared
in the name of the ideology.
To be mounted, let alone.
So you were de-radicalized yourself, Hanif.
Is meaningless.
You were de-radicalized yourself, cleansed, if I may say, living a civilized life. And 400 people of national security concern are believed to have returned to the UK from conflict in Syria and Iraq. What is your assessment? You mentioned the programs before of the terrorism prevention and investigation measures applied to returnees in the UK.
The current programs that we have in place are unfortunately pathetic, if I may say so. There are, and I don't mean across the board, I mean there are some good programs out there that are led by some very remarkable and very experienced individuals. But the policies and the procedures and the methodology that we have from government doesn't go far enough. It's very risk averse. So when we're talking about people like, Jack Letts or Shamima Begum, we're not putting in place experienced, well-grounded, well-meaning practitioners to disengage and de-radicalize these individuals. We are very much a more securitized policy where we use policing and imprisonment as a means to protect society instead of allowing for experienced practitioners to work with such individuals. And unfortunately, our programs are not fit for purpose.
Listen, Liberal Democrats in the UK, they call to change the rules of the UK citizenship. They believe that the Home Secretary has too much power at the moment, power that could be used, for trying to gain some political points. They suggest a policy change that would mean that a future Home Secretary will have to apply to the courts before stripping someone off his or her citizenship. What do you think about that?
Look, with regards to the Home Secretary's powers, and look, I might be contradictory here, but I believe that certain powers need to be had by the Home Secretary, but not to be used for political and public posturing. They need to be used seriously and sensibly, but also with an understanding of the impact of those powers or the application of those powers. I don't think that having to go to court to apply for that would necessarily be beneficial. I still believe that the Home Secretary should have certain powers, but apply them in a very sensible, in a very sensitive and effective way, rather than having a very political outlook. We've been driven by politics currently with regards to our terrorism prevention programs and prevent programs. It's got a lot of politics attached to it. A lot of individuals are using it to promote their careers and their ambitions. However, if it's been used sensibly and sensitively, I think the program that we had pre-2012 was a very effective program. And we are moving away from that effectiveness by becoming more politically correct or pandering to the politics of certain institutions.
Well, the PREVENT policy was introduced in the UK in 2003 as part of an overall post-9/11 counter-terrorism approach. From your expertise, Hanif, what advice would you give to governments worldwide who are seeking to strike a balance there between maintaining security at home and respecting the human rights of many disillusioned ISIS wives or ISIS fighters who have raised the white flag and now they're struggling to come home?
Look, the advice, the contest and prevent strategy was effectively rolled out in late 2006, 2007. It's been work in progress since 2003. And it's also been work in progress since its inception. And it's continuously, we're going through contest 4. We're looking at another review of the contest strategy, which tells you that it's not been effective enough. We've been very politically motivated by how it's supposed to be delivered. But my advice to governments around the world is to work with the communities that you believe. Look, we've got to work with all of our communities. It's got to be a community-led initiative supported by government, police, and security services. And you cannot kill your way out of this problem or, fight your way out of this problem. It's got to be dealt and it's got to be delivered by effective, credible community institutions and community programs. But by applying a overly hostile policy or program that's targeting one particular community is not going to change or make it effective. It's actually going to be counterproductive. And we've got to look at the recent rise in far-right terrorism. Is actually the biggest problem at the moment within many countries, including the US and the UK. So we've got much more of a far-right terrorist threat than we have an Islamic, based terrorist threat. So it shows that because we've been particularly focused on one particular community, especially the Muslim community, who have felt this as a hostile approach, have actually shut down communication and engagement. And by doing that, we're not giving a chance for those communities to fix the problems with themselves. But also, by being focused heavily on a Muslim community, we're giving the far-right extremists more wind to their sails to rise up and actually blame the other community. So our policies, our procedures, and our efforts have been counterproductive, but also they're being given the wind to the sails of the far-right terrorists. So it shows you that by not being sensitive and sensible when we're working, to tackle extremism, we're creating a bigger problem. So you have to work with the communities, not be hostile towards them. So any country that's going to be doing, counter-violent extremism work or prevention of terrorism, you have to work with communities. You cannot ignore that. So you have to be friendly and be able to access those communities, because terrorism, in all its ugly forms, stems from within society. So we have to be very sensible in our approach and work and engage with every segment within our community.
Mr. Hanif Qadir, thank you for these words, this very interesting interview. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
And thank you all for watching the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Heinrich, coming to you from New York City.